Proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Good morning and welcome to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Today the committee is holding its second oral evidence session in our inquiry on the membership of the House of Lords. This inquiry will examine the arrangements for the appointments of the House of Lords, its size and composition, and the effectiveness of its role in relation to the House of Commons. We have one panel this morning with the former and present chairs of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. Good morning to you both. I wonder if you might introduce yourselves for the record, beginning perhaps with Baroness Deech.
Good morning, Chair. I'm Ruth Deech. I took over from Lord Bute in mid-November. I'm a crossbench peer, and in my past life I've been an academic, chair of Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, Bar Standards Board, and a few other bodies like that.
Very much. Lord Bute.
I'm Paul Bute, Chair. I'm also a crossbench peer, and for the 4 preceding years, before Ruth's recent appointment, I was the chair of HOLAC, and before that, chair of the Committee on Standards and Public Life.
Thank you both very much indeed. An open question from me first, if I may. How would you evaluate the current appointment process to the House of Lords? Perhaps Lord Bute.
That's the most difficult one. But let me say, for the chair of HOLAC, there's a rather strange thing that you actually, when I think about the appointment process, my mind immediately goes to the 7 people that we appointed to the crossbenches, and we looked at them both for suitability and propriety. And I think of the labour of interviewing them, selecting them, trying to be fair, trying to do the best thing for what the House needed. It's actually very difficult to get it right. All you can do is try honestly to approach the job in a serious and fair way with respect to the nature of the United Kingdom as a society as a whole. But in fact, for most people, those 7 people that came through on my watch, for example, to the crossbenchers, are actually a minor thing. For most people, it is the over 100 appointments made on the Prime, not all Conservatives, of course, some were in the recommendation of the Labour Party, but the over 100 political appointments, then the 30 in that special category of distinguished individuals, which has, for example, led to a considerable swelling of the House of Lords in recent years, a function, if I can put this very simply, of the broad political crisis that we went through in the last few years, of considerably less stable politics in this building than a previous generation. But for most people, that's the thing that they're focused on. And here the problem is that we have no say in the suitability of those people, unlike the 7 that we appoint, and it's a matter of propriety. What we tried to do on my watch was to, and it's continuing under Baroness Deech's watch, as to somehow strengthen the limited role that we have by laying considerable emphasis on the Committee on Standards and Public Life. Now, that in itself is not lacking in ambiguity, because, for example, if you're talking about a political appointment, one of the key principles of Committee on Standards and Public Life is selflessness. Now, I'm actually not convinced that normal political life and selflessness are always at one. So you have to do this with some common sense. Openness is another one. It's not always possible to be entirely open in politics for good reasons. So these are good principles, though, basically, and provided that you apply them with common sense and not absurd rigidity, I think we were right. I tried to publicise this, wrote on October the 22nd in 2022 to the party leaders on this point, to try to inject consideration of those factors into the appointments that they make.
Thank you. And I suppose if I could ask the same question of you, Baroness Deech, and maybe reflecting a little what Lord Bute has said, because in some of the evidence we've had to our inquiry, distrust and discontent has been expressed, and I just wondered to what extent you thought the appointments process might be to blame for that.
The blame is, I think, a bit unfair because we have to operate within the parameters that we have. And I have to say that in everything I do, and the reason I took the job, and I think here I speak for all the Commission members, our prime concern is the reputation of the House and the way it is perceived and the quality of its members, and indeed, as a byproduct, the reputation of the party leaders who nominate people to the House, and indeed the reputation of those people. So we are driven by reputation, quality, and the perception of the House. And I think I'm not saying anything out of order if I say that certainly the media have a rather lower give the House of Lords a rather lower reputation than is deserved, but there's no question but that it is a rather difficult period. So that is what drives us. Now, we have two parts to the job. When it comes to selecting crossbench peers who have applied themselves, we apply the most stringent criteria. The success rate is something over 1%. Only just over 1% of all the people who apply have ended up with a seat in the House of Lords. They're sifted rigorously. They are interviewed. They provide references. But the other half of the job, we are limited. We can only check on the propriety, a phrase susceptible to all sorts of meanings, of the political nominations put forward by the other parties. And I'm not saying that those people aren't up to scratch in any way, but it's much harder to satisfy the public and ourselves that these are people of the same excellent, outstanding qualities that we're looking for in the crossbenchers, because all we can check is propriety. So two parts of the job, rather conflicting.
And you're absolutely right to make that distinction, and my apologies if I was lost in my question. But as you alluded to, the current appointment system relies on convention and non-statutory guidance and interpretation of certain words, indeed. Is that sufficient to protect the appointments process from abuse, or are statutory measures needed? Baroness Deech, and then back to Lord Bute, perhaps.
Well, the entire structure rests on nothing but a white paper, I think of the year 2000, which is a rather flimsy basis to have. At the other extreme, you might say, and the Commission hasn't formed a view on this, that we should be put on a statutory basis. That could be good, but if it went too far, it could be problematic. I mean, speaking for myself, I don't really believe that any Prime Minister would accept that his or her veto, his or her final word in the process would be taken away. But I can see some merit myself in having a statutory basis that sets out criteria and various other things. But at the moment, it is really rather flimsy. As is well known, a Prime Minister recently rejected our advice about a particular candidate. We have no assurance, for example, as to how many crossbenchers we can appoint. It's 2 at the moment, 2 a year. It used to be 6. And I know there's pressure on numbers, but we would dearly like to see more crossbenchers, given the huge press of numbers. And again, the reporting system. I mean, I gather, for example, that we are acquiring another member of the Commission. I didn't know about this, but the government is deciding that we should have another member. So, we lack a firm structure. That, of course, is not unlike the rest of the British Constitution being unwritten, so it's nothing unusual. But you do feel it as chair of the Commission.
So really, in terms of any statutory measures, not saying put the whole thing on a statutory footing, but you've got aspects there you've mentioned in terms of your structure and composition. Is there anything else that you think might be more favourable to statutory footing?
No, I don't think so, because there are other issues which are very political, which are beyond our remit, things like numbers, balance, and so on, which really we can't do much about, especially given what a small body we are.
And really, Lord Bute, that same theme of question, in terms of that reliance upon convention and non-statutory guidance, is that sufficient?
Well,
your experience.
There's one way in which I think the context has changed in recent years, and you have to, I think this point I'm about to make has to be taken into account when we discuss the debate between statutory and non-statutory. And that is that with the event that I talked to you about at this committee the last time I was here, and Ruth has just referred to, where we did say no to a candidate and the Prime Minister then said yes. Now, you then probed about that and to me, and I said I thought if it were to happen again, it was quite conceivable that the Commission itself would resign. Now, I think that what Baroness Deech has just said about no Prime Minister will give up the long-standing right to appoint or under our current, anything like our current recognisable system will give up such a right. And nor am I actually as such campaigning against it. I am saying that a certain limitation has effectively entered into the exercise of that right. Not the abolition of it, not the removal of it, nothing like that, but the exercise of it as a consequence of the fallout from the events we discussed when I last spoke to you. So, sometimes I hear people advocate statutory a solution as if it's designed to solve a problem which may already be, to a significant degree, solved. That is my point. But we, in terms of, for example, the Burns report, which seems to fit with a statutory conclusion, we have, as a Commission, nodded favourably towards that from time to time.
You mentioned there the example we spoke of at your last appearance in terms of that candidate that you recommended against and the Prime Minister of the day nonetheless appointed. Might that be, and you cite the risk of to the Commission itself if that were to happen again. So not in terms of the Prime Minister giving up their right of appointment, but in terms of a HOLAC finding against that. Might that be a route to consider?
Well, it's clearly. I'm simply saying that I think now it's not any longer. I'm no longer chair, so I'm not going to legislate for. I'm simply saying that my strong sense is that the Prime Ministers, since that point, are aware that the atmospherics around us, that's putting it loosely, have actually changed. I mean, I just think we are in new terrain because of the reaction. And let me say, there was a very open and public exchange, and the Prime Minister of the day gave his reasons, frankly and publicly, for what he was doing. That's also to be noted. But nonetheless, my sense is that in a significant respect, the relative weight of HOLAC in this process, regardless of whether it becomes a statutory body or whatever, has actually gone up rather than gone down, as an entirely, by the way, unintentional consequence. At the time when you are looking at these matters, you're looking at it purely in terms of what you consider to be the rubric and essentially the rules and obligations which HOLAC is supposed to uphold. I wasn't thinking of what the medium or long-term consequence would be. I was just thinking, nor was the Commission. We were just thinking we have no alternative but to take this action. Now, but I think that there has been a medium and long-term consequence, and I think that HOLAC is actually it's somewhat stronger in this great maelstrom of this, and that has to be confessed, this very, very huge number of political appointments, which is the political crisis that the country has gone through. I mean, I dealt with 3 Prime Ministers' resignation honours list. I never expected for one moment to have to do that. And again, it places weight on a smallish secretariat, which it was not designed to deal with that weight of pressure either.
Thank you. Just from each of you, I wonder if you might summarise one particular priority for reform in the appointments process.
Well, I speak for myself as a matter of reform. The Commission hasn't really discussed this. Well, maybe there are 2 linked issues. We would like to get more information from the political leaders about the people that they're putting forward as potential peers. We do our vetting and we do a lot of research, but it seems to me that it would be for the benefit of all, both the parties and the House of Lords, if we got much more information from the party leaders when they put forward a name. What we get at the moment is rather sketchy. We would like to know why they've chosen this person rather than many others who might be similar, whether the nominee they've put forward is aware of and has lived up to the Nolan principles, whether there is anything in their past that might be embarrassing if it comes out, and most importantly, whether they are aware of the demands of being a peer, that they will actually turn up, not just take the title and go away, but they will turn up and be prepared to sit through the long hours that we do sit through, to make a contribution, to speak, to handle amendments, to debate, and so on. All these things are important. And given the resources of the political parties and the number of people they can draw on, you would have thought that was really quite a straightforward thing for them to do. As it happens, we have updated the forms which we call on them to fill in to reflect more of this. Not all of it, we're inching forward. And those forms will become public later this week. And we've written to the party political leaders to explain to them that we would like them to do a bit more, shall I call it, due diligence before they put forward names. And we do this simply because, as I said, we want to be sure that the public can see that quality is going forward in the House of Lords, that we're striving to maintain its reputation. We're not just opening the door for anyone nominated by any party to come forward, but we're really scrutinising the qualities of new nominees with a view to upholding the work and the capabilities of the House of Lords.
Thank you. Lord Bew.
First of all, I want to say I agree with everything that Ruth has just said very, very strongly, and we tried to move, but she is moving more strongly in that direction. We tried to move in that direction in my time. To move slightly more into the middle distance, you asked about what could, and one of the things I want to anticipate what's about to happen is a discussion about size. But just to say, I am personally, and now I no longer speak to the Commission, I am personally tempted by one of the Burns ideas of 15-year terms. If I could just say one contextual word about the size of the House of Lords, I would say that before the crisis, or what we'll call the revolution in British politics and constitutional structures arising out of Brexit, we were making, I think, as far as I could judge, and I wasn't then in the job, reasonable progress to slimming down by natural means. And what has happened is that for reasons, and to be absolutely honest, I think they're a function of the inherent crisis that the system went through rather than any one person's particular agenda. Obviously there were people with particular agendas, but now the House of Lords is swelling again, and we're now back to regular jokes about the Chinese Congress and 900 people and so on and so forth. And we were actually moving away. It's necessary to remember 5 years or so, 6 years ago, so we were beginning to move away from that. But now, because of the circumstances that we've talked about, the numbers are swelling. And I think it is necessary to acknowledge that the gentler ideas that we had in place, and I'm now speaking personally, 6, 7 years, the world has changed.
Thank you very much indeed. Lloyd, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I by your analysis that the place is swelling, yeah. Is it that is a natural consequence of when you have political change? It swelled after the coalition government with huge numbers of people putting in. It then went down, yeah, and then it swelled when we had Brexit because it was political change. And there's a danger it will swell again if we have another big political change. So is it 15 years, or is actually what we're saying is we want to restrict the numbers that can go in as quickly?
Well, I have to admit, because I'm preparing for this, I was looking at Burns' recommendations, and I thought, as opposed, by the way, to some ideas I myself put forward in the past before I had the job, I thought now the 15 years is the one that I can hook on to make the most sense, but it's not the only possible means of doing it. And you're right to remind me that it's not just the post-Brexit period. The coalition government and the dynamics of that also did lead to a swelling, of the Lords in certain ways, and we are, looking at the possibility of a change of government this year. There are real problems that unless something which inevitably one leads to difficulties and possibly another resignation on his list of a prime minister, possibly. I just don't want to get drawn into science fiction because I don't know the future any more than anybody else. But the real problem is that we are looking at circumstances which I don't think it's too controversial to say may lead to no diminution in the swelling, put it like that, further swelling of the numbers, and that's why I've been looking more closely at Burton's recommendations.
And that goes along with then getting rid of the hereditaries if you're going to have 15 years.
Sorry.
Thank
you, Lloyd, for your supplementary. Damien Moore, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. In 2022, Lord Bute told us that the government had never discussed with HOLAC our predecessor committee's recommendations, which included requiring written statements of nomination and giving HOLAC a role in monitoring and reporting on the diversity of nominees. Has the government now discussed either of these issues with HOLAC?
Not to my knowledge, no.
I want to say one thing just in defence of when Liz Truss did seek a meeting with me, which did not happen when she was Prime Minister, because in fact that clashed very unfortunately with the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly meeting which I'm on, and there would have been an opportunity to discuss some of those points, but there was no discussion as such in my time. But I can't reasonably say that because of that example, and indeed some other signals from Number 10 at various times, that there was necessarily an obdurate position, but it did not happen, and there was one offer which didn't go ahead, and it was actually my fault, and within 2 weeks Liz Truss was no longer the Prime Minister in that particular case.
Diversity is tied up with numbers. It's very, very difficult to keep diversity in the forefront when you're only appointing, say, 2 crossbenchers every year or so. I mean, one would love to say a big spread of talents and genders, but very hard if you've only got 2. And I'm with Paul on trying to find a way to keep the numbers down. I think the House of Lords has to do it for itself. That's my view. I think each party ought to find a way of reducing its own numbers by, say, 20%, with whatever criterion they choose, whether it's age or length of service or attendance. But I do think they have to do it. It has been said that it doesn't matter because you never get more than 400 or 500 people turning up. But even that's a lot, and sometimes there are debates where lots of people sign up and you end up getting 1 minute each because there is no time. And people are fighting to get on committees, fighting to get desk space and so on. The numbers really have to come down, in my view. And that would give us more of a breathing space to promote diversity.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Jones.
Yes, Lord Bute, you've touched on this earlier in this session, but I'd like to explore it a bit more if I may. You previously suggested that a chair of HOLAC might resign if he or she disagreed with the Prime Minister's decision to proceed with an appointment. Do you think that that is actually necessary?
Well, because you can't anticipate the exact nature of the case, I need to be very, and I acknowledge this. But I did say to this committee that I thought, in the aftermath of the previous case that we discussed here, that I did think that a resignation of a committee in an action replay case where the issues were the same, and in the sense that the committee had a clear view of what was at stake for the committee in terms of what it considered to be its obligations to behave properly. In an action replay case, I think to be honest, I can only speak for on my watch. I think in an action replay case, I think the committee would most likely have resigned. Now, you have to, you see, the circumstances of all these cases differ. And, I'm very, and that's the caveat I have to put in. And I certainly do not think that it is anybody who takes this job, it's now Ruth's responsibility, should be looking for a casus belli and should be looking for occasions to show to the Prime Minister of the day that I will not be pushed around and so on and being unduly, pushing the boundaries of HOLAC. I do not think that's the case. I just think that HOLAC has a certain role, and that role is not for suitability for political appointments, but for propriety. There are certain characteristics of the way we have judged propriety. I think there's something like 17 on my watch didn't go through. There are certain definitions that are in play in respect of that. And if we were being pushed to the point where we weren't able to do that which we were expected to do by statute, by the original legislation, then I don't think that the committee would want to carry on.
Doesn't that actually amount to the committee asserting that it has a right of veto, and if the Prime Minister doesn't observe what the committee says, then the committee can, if you like, flounce off?
Look, I understand exactly why, Sir Jones, you said that, and I was trying to avoid it, because I'm not, you see, I think the system does depend on the Prime Minister having this right in the system. And I acknowledge that, and I understand that while it's not as fashionable as it once was, there is a serious constitutional argument that that has been a good feature of the British Constitution over a long period of time, and a number of serious constitutional experts would continue to hold to that view. I am not saying anything other than that we operate in a common sense context of certain assumptions about how our written constitution works. And there are always things that a Prime Minister might do that they don't actually choose to do because they think that it would flout certain, assumptions that exist out there about how a Prime Minister should behave. And I think we have moved into the territory in terms of ordinary opinion that the Prime Minister would have to bear in mind that ordinary opinion would take the view that if HOLAC has a serious issue on a propriety, it's not suitability. For all that we have said about how we'd like to know more about suitability, there's no way in which HOLAC can really say, I think that you want such and such a person to be in the Lords, and I think that the most dreary party hack I've ever encountered will contribute nothing. There is absolutely no way that we should be doing anything like that. But on propriety, if we think there is a serious issue, and don't forget, this includes just very basic things. The public has a right to expect that people who come to this Parliament pay their taxes. So I mean, that's what I'm saying. I think we have a right to insist on. We're expected to be a guardian of certain reasonable public assumptions about Parliament, and I think that a Prime Minister would take it into account. But I totally agree. Baroness Deech said it. The Prime Minister has that absolute authority.
Yes, and that is the point, isn't it? If the Prime Minister gets it wrong, if he makes an egregious mistake, then it's on his head, not on HOLAC's head.
That is my view.
Well, I've had something of this discussion, and the answer was from number 10 that the Prime Minister would be accountable. That's too late, though, because once someone is in here, let's imagine they are not suitable, they're there for the rest of their lives. So being accountable is really too late. But on the question of resignation, the risk is this: if the chair, or indeed the entire commission, resigns, and there's no statutory underpinning, there is a danger that the Prime Minister will just say, all right, I can function without you. We really don't need you. I'll just make all the appointments I want to. We will even run the crossbench appointments. So I think actually publicity is maybe a stronger weapon, that if it is publicised to this committee and to the world that the Commission did not approve Mr. X, that is a stain on the reputation of the Prime Minister, who flouts our advice. It's a stain on the reputation of Mr. or Mrs. X for the rest of their lives. They'll always have that badge hanging around their necks that they were regarded as unsuitable. So I think that's quite powerful.
It's not a stain on HOLAC, though, is it? HOLAC in those circumstances would have been vindicated.
Because we would have done our duty,
yes.
And if the Prime Minister flouts us, then And if we're right in regarding this person as improper, as an appointment, the blame lies elsewhere.
You mentioned earlier the issue of crossbench peers. There have been no such nominations under the tenure of the last two prime ministers. Do you believe that there will be more crossbench peers in the years to come? Do you think that you will retain or recover the role of recommending and appointing crossbench peers?
Well, I bear in mind the pressure on numbers, but given the fierce competition, the hundreds of suitable, more than suitable people who apply, hundreds of excellent people who apply, it would be nice to see more than 2 a year. And in all the plans for reform of the House of Lords that I've seen, everyone seems to agree that 20% ought to be crossbenches. So I'm hoping that HOLAC would be allowed to choose, not the Prime Minister, but I'm hoping that HOLAC would be allowed to select more than 2 a year in the forthcoming years, yes.
Lord Bute?
Yeah, so I mean, there's something like 6,800 applications, something of that sort, since the process began of inviting crossbench applications, and we are appointing the rate of 98.5% or something of these candidates are unfortunately unsuccessful, and some of them, many of them, are really, really excellent people, and it's a great pity to reject them. I would say one thing, I mean, in all the controversy about the House of Lords, and you know how much it is now subject to controversy and how much criticism there is in the press, the one thing you don't see criticised is the independent crossbench members. And particularly, that's in a sense relatively recent, because up to about 2007 there was press criticism. And that was because I don't think, and I think it would be acknowledged by those involved at the time, there wasn't a clear enough message, which really begins about 2006, 2007, that this is not an honour that if you come through by this route, it is a job more than an honour. And that is over the last 15 years, I think, more or less stuck as a way in which people have behaved. So you can make a case for saying some people have come through and maybe they were over-energetic in one area and didn't achieve anything or whatever. That's not the point. They did try, and I think you can see that. And there isn't criticism to the same extent as so many other aspects of the life of the House of Lords are subject to criticism, but not of the role of the independent crossbenchers. So I agree, I'd very much like to see. I'm not, to be honest, because of our concerns about size, and only 7 came through during my watch. I'm not, to be honest, expecting anything to radically improve, but I would like to see that. If I could just add one thing on, just to remind that Liz Truss was the Prime Minister during my last weeks, so that's why at that point that she was willing, she asked to see me, and other, like so many things to do with HOLAC or House of Lords, wider tides swallowed all that up. I just wanted to make that point, but I'm trying to make the point that number 10, for example, then, and my sense is subsequent, there's been a dialogue clearly with the idea that there is no dialogue or no willingness to have a discussion it would not be fair to number 10. I just simply want to make that point.
Thank you. Chairman, before I go any further, forgive me, but I should have declared an interest earlier. I chair the Council for Arab-British Understanding, which has made a submission to this inquiry.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Jones. Thank you, Sir Lord Bute. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chair. Baroness Deech, when you, in your pre-appointment hearing here, you told us that you'd like to see HOLAC advise on the suitability of candidates and the production of, and the nominator and nominee making public statements as to suitability and qualification to become a member of the House of Lords. Now that you've been in the role for a little while, I just wondered whether you've reflected on that and whether you still hold that view, or if they've changed at all. I
haven't resigned from that view. As I said a few minutes ago, we would like to get much more information from the political parties about the people they are nominating. And at some stage, I think there ought to be a fairly full description of what they've done that means that they merit a place here. I'm sure all of us have got CVs, one would expect a fairly full description. I've noticed when sitting in the House of Lords and new peers are introduced, we get a piece of paper saying who they are, but it is sketchy, very sketchy indeed. And when you think of how we trawl through applicants for crossbench appointments, they put in CVs, letters of references, lists of their publications, all sorts of things. I think we need to know when someone enters the House of Lords, this distinguished chamber in this ancient parliament, what they are made of, what they can contribute, what they've done in the past. We need to be sure that they have something exceptional to contribute. So I think there should be more statements about what they've done from the party, maybe they themselves. They're probably going to compose their own CVs anyway. So no, I haven't changed my mind on that. It is not for us, I should add, to judge on political suitability. Depends what you mean by suitability. Mm-hmm. We cannot opine on someone's political views and why they appeal to one party or another. But in a sort of lesser interpretation of suitability, in a general sense, yes, not just why are they suitable, but why are they really rather special and worthy of this place. But absolutely, we cannot give an opinion on their political suitability. That is something for the parties to determine themselves.
And sort of, we've had a discussion about propriety quite a lot, but just on that and sort of, whether, resignation and so forth of chairs. But I just wondered if there are any other sort of, whether, if on terms of HOLAC's decisions on propriety should be sort of enforceable in any way, and what a sort of mechanism for enforceability might look like.
Well, I wouldn't call it enforceability, but if there are doubts or indeed a failure in the propriety checking, then we bring it to the attention of the nominator. Sometimes the problem is something temporary, which will be resolved and sorted out. Or if there is a serious issue over propriety, we offer the nominator the chance to put forward somebody else. But certainly we make our views known, and in nearly all of the cases, that is effective, and the party will either wait for the issue to be resolved or put forward somebody else or withdraw that nomination. So in that sense, it is effective, yes.
Thank you. John McDonnell.
Just on the appointment process itself, I've been taking notes of what you've been saying. I just want to sum up what I think you've got to. At the moment, you said you don't think that any PM will allow its power to be taken away in terms of issues around appointments and propriety and suitability. Neither of you are seeking enforceability of your views with regard to propriety. Neither of you are seeking a veto of candidates on suitability. But what you are saying, this, Lord Bew, you said this, is that actually your recent experience of certain appointments has enabled the risk of resignation of the Commission to change the ball game to a certain extent, and that you're reliant upon resignation to get the message across to Prime Minister, to use your expression, that the Commission won't be pushed around. Do you think that, both of you really, in your experiences, do you think that message is landed with those that advise the Prime Minister and Prime Ministers?
I think it has. As my colleague, the distinguished historian Peter Hennessy, has said, our unwritten constitution relies on being operated by good chaps and chapesses. And I think we are in an era of good chaps, and I think this is understood. I think the risk is much more with numbers, actually, than quality. Yeah, okay. I think the message that we've put forward about quality has hit home, and we have had discussions with number 10. My current fear, given that this is an election year, lies in numbers and what they call the leapfrog problem. And actually, I don't think it's possible for any one party to achieve any stable majority in the House of Lords, because it's not just Labour and Tory, it's the bishops it's the Lib Dems, it's the crossbenchers, the unaffiliated. So even if another party puts in another 100 people, there's no way that anyone can guarantee a majority. And actually, I think that's quite healthy, because most people in the House of Lords, although there is a whip, most people will think long and hard about their vote. And we crossbenchers, of course, we need not fear that. We can vote with our consciences. And I think that's a good thing.
I understand where you come from in terms of majorities. But it's the use of the appointment system by way of rewarding individuals for what some would think are corrupt practices, for donations, etc. So it's not just about majorities, it's about the operation of the system itself. So, Lord Bute, what you're saying is we rely upon resignation, because although Hennessy says we rely upon good chaps and good chapesses, we used to have a member of this committee who quite rightfully would regularly remind us of what happens if you've got a wrong 'un in position.
If I could say one thing which has to be taken into account here, on my watch there were 17 turn downs no's which were not challenged by number 10. So that would imply that a common sense is how do we proceed? A new common sense is coming into place. That's the crucial thing that I would.
I interject there. Of that 17, did I hear you correctly? Was that number ever published, or was it just something that?
Well, I was checking my notes. That I think I'm correct in saying maybe 16.
But I don't recall.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have. Is it on our website? I'm not sure.
It is.
Right. Sorry.
It could be in one of our reports. I don't know. I'd have to check that. But we're not ashamed of saying it.
No. And actually, I think in the context of what we're discussing, it's very useful and reassuring, perhaps. Lord Bute, sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. I'm actually very grateful to clarify I got the number broadly right. And I'm simply indicating that I certainly remember a number of cases where we were saying back to number 10, and of course, as everybody around this table is aware, this doesn't just apply to one party, where things did not go ahead, and that's I think that just a sign that I don't think that, and I can recall, by the way, on these cases, very little arm wrestling. I can't recall any, but my memory may be going, but certainly not substantive arm wrestling on these points. So I think that there is a subtle change in the underlying constitutional assumption on this matter. Our problem is, as Baroness Deech has indicated, that on issues such as size and other issues, while we may be moving into a better place in that respect for the House of Lords and for the role of HOLAC, there are a number of other really massive problems which we are not quite sure yet how to handle.
Remember, there is a backstop too. Since the 2014 or 15, the House of Lords is able to expel members for misconduct and for not turning up. And that does help to some extent.
Has that happened?
Has it happened?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
How many times do you know?
I don't have the numbers, but for example, there was one Labour peer who's gone to prison and has been expelled. Others have taken leave of absence. I can think of another one who made headlines, front page photographs for drugs and so on. Yes, I'm sure we all know the cases. That has happened, yes.
Well, just to go back to my question, do you think the message has landed with all the political parties now?
Well, I'm doing my best to make sure it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this committee will assist in that endeavour.
Just one other point. We raised the issue of diversity before. I think we had the discussion at your pre-appointments hearing and when you last came, Lord Bute. What role do you think HOAC should have in just ensuring diversity amongst their lords?
Well, it's all mixed up with the numbers issue and the Prime Minister or political leaders' appointments. We can only achieve diversity in the political appointments if the party leaders put forward diverse people. On the crossbench appointments, we are very mindful of the different types of expertise that we need, of regional disparities, gender disparities, ethnicity, and so on. We're very mindful of that. But if you're only picking two people, from a list of several hundred, that is very difficult to achieve. We bear it in mind all the time, but you need much more flexibility if you're going to achieve diversity. And actually, it's not so bad. I mean, if you look at the paintings on the walls as you walk around the corridors of this place, the paintings of the Lords the way it used to be, and even that famous painting by Andrew Festing, and you look at the Lords now, it is much more diverse. It's something like 26% women. Ethnic minority, it's hard to count. It depends what your criterion are. But if you look at the adult population, not the younger population of Britain, where the ethnicity spread is much greater, it's not too bad here, but we do bear it in mind, I assure you, all the time, given the constraints within which we work. And it's very difficult. Sorry, it's very difficult for anyone from the north or anyone in a very sort of ordinary job to afford to come here. No one is going to suggest that we have salaries or any extra. But if you have an ordinary job and you live in the northwest and you need accommodation in London and you need a salary, sitting here would be well nigh impossible unless you had the backing of some organisation.
That was the point I would just want to make. The Midlands as well. Midlands, North, Northwest, our own numbers, which I think are available, show a significant underrepresentation as against the broad London South East area. And I was aware of it all the time doing it on that crossbench here. And to be absolutely honest, for all that I was aware of it, in the 4 years I was there, it really scratched the surface of the problem, because with such a small number of appointments, it really, to be aware of a problem is one thing, but to have a solution in that context, I didn't actually have one.
Thank you very much indeed. Joe Gideon, please.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. So going back to looking at HOLAC on a statutory footing, what would be the value of putting HOLAC on a statutory footing, Baroness Deech?
Well, the Commission as a whole has not discussed this, so it's my personal view. The value of putting on a statutory footing is that the public would see that Parliament has firmly put itself on the side of certain criteria for eligibility, maybe both for crossbench appointments and political appointments, that the constitution of the Commission would be on a firm basis, and it would be much harder, indeed maybe impossible, for there to be political interference. Maybe it would make the Commission answerable to Parliament rather than number 10. It would not, in my view, include HOLAC being able to veto the Prime Minister in the last resort, but it would set out the rest of our working structure and our criteria more firmly and more clearly, and it would show that Parliament has thrown its weight behind this particular method of choosing people. So to my mind, that would be the advantage.
I'm moving in that direction. When I was chair, I would attend pretty regular debates in the House of Lords. Lord Norton's great academic expert on the subject of House of Lords reform and a great defender of our system, which he calls asymmetric, i.e. weak bicameralism. I attended regularly debates, Lord Cormac, Lord Burns and others speaking. And during that time, I didn't take a position at all, because I'm not sure that the Commission would have been united in any way. There was quite enough work to do in front of my eyes on a daily basis at HOLAC. But I think it is shifting in that direction. I think that the scale of the problems, which committee members have alluded to, facing the House of Lords in terms of size, imply some certain. We're all probably anticipating certain kind of fairly obvious reforms before too long. But the scale of the problem is, if you're going to have to do some kind of reform process, I would be surprised, and I shouldn't be speculating, it's not my job, but I'd be surprised if absolutely nothing happens in these areas over the next period of time. Then one might, I think, give serious consideration to giving the statutory role for the reasons articulated by Ruth. I've come to my slightly dreary point that, in fact, some of the things that people want to clean up as a result of that, I hope have already been cleaned up. If I can, but that's the one thing I wanted to say. But nonetheless, there are other wider questions at stake here.
So, if HOLAC were put on a statutory footing, what powers should it be given, and is there a realistic prospect that the Prime Minister would cede these powers to HOLAC?
Well, I don't think that in the last resort, as I've said, any Prime Minister of any party would give up the ultimate right to insist that someone be appointed. But other than that, I would expect the criteria of selection to be put on a statutory basis. And I'm imagining that maybe a decade along from now, there will be more reform of the House of Lords, and that HOLAC and its powers would be a part of that. I mean, it's not unreasonable or fanciful to imagine a time when the number of hereditary peers, maybe even bishops, is removed or cut down. And I expect that HOLAC would have a part in that. But I also remember last time, about 12, 14 years ago, there was a big attempt to reform the House of Lords, which in the end the House of Commons didn't back. And I've mentioned this before. It's because I think very often long-serving MPs, many of whom are greatly admired by the public, rather fancy, if they're still, fairly young, a berth in the House of Lords after they retire. An MP who's served 30 or 40 years to great acclaim. And also, I'm not sure that the House of Commons would ever want a House of Lords that was so democratic that it was a challenge, or maybe even superior to the House of Commons. So I think in reality there are certain limits as to how much reform there will be. But I can certainly see some to appointment, structure, and content coming.
It's not just long-serving ones as well.
There's a name to veto.
Thank you.
Have you got anything to add to that?
Again, largely agree with Baroness Deech's comments. I don't want to make things unnecessarily tangled and difficult. I do think that one of the ideas which is out there in Burns and other places will be very hard under any disposition to work, which is to give HOLAC a role with respect to balance of parties. I just don't quite see how that would work. And maybe it's a failure of imagination on my part. There are certain very obvious things at this stage which are at the low end of the scale. I mean, people come into the House of Lords who do not come before us for any the hereditaries, any propriety checks at all, those who come through the Church of England, and also it might seem to be considered unnecessary, but for example, those who come through from the Supreme Court, which still happens, even though not on the way it once did. Now, actually, it seems to me it's a basic democratic consideration that everybody should at least. I mean, I'm sure the most likely thing in the case of all these people is they're very admirable, but those are clearly things can be done, and done quite quickly. It's actually the question of the wider reform of the House of Lords is a major question, which is why in my time, and I was simply, and given the fact there was so much turmoil, there were 3 Prime Ministers' resignation honours lists, there were many people who didn't believe that in any of those resignation honours lists were right in the first place to have them. Given the fact that it was dealing with that degree of turmoil, I concentrated on that kind of narrow detail and didn't lift up my eyes to look to the future. To my original answer, I do think that the argument is shifting towards some kind of statutory role. I don't think it can necessarily be quite as strong as some envisage, and nor will it be, my warning would be, quite as dramatic in its good effects as some envisage either, even in a perfect world.
You both touched on the idea that actually having more crossbench peers would be a good thing. So how can HOLAC's role in nominating new crossbench peers and improving diversity in the House of Lords be balanced with efforts to limit the size of the chamber?
Well, that's precisely the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
We would like the political leaders to nominate fewer so that we can put forward more crossbench peers. We can see that there are gaps in the expertise which is available in the House of Lords, which we'd like to fill, and gaps, as I've said, in the distribution of professions and qualifications. But we can't do that unless the political leaders will stand back for a bit and give us some breathing room so that we can appoint more crossbenchers. For example, we're looking for people with AI expertise, pandemic expertise, day-by-day teaching, though, as I said, it's very hard to recruit a teacher because, they've got a job, and I don't know how you would reconcile that. They'd have to retire or something. But we're aware of the gaps, and we'd like to do it, but we need the political leaders to give us that space.
That's just precisely true. And I mentioned earlier, we're conscious of all these things and didn't succeed because it's actually impossible when you're only making 2 appointments a year. And there's, I made 7, as I say. I think there's over 130 in the end coming through on my watch. So that gives you how small my role or scope for dealing with diversity and these areas of expertise. And we are the only body, I think this is important to consider, that when these issues suddenly appear, pandemic, AI and so on, HOLAC is the one place where the Commission is sitting there thinking, we've got a new problem here, and Parliament doesn't have expertise in this area, let's deal with it. And that's one of the very important and good things about HOLAC, but our power to deal much about it is limited. Not non-existent, but limited.
Thank you. Damien.
Thank you. As a way of increasing crossbench peers, should HOLAC have the power to nominate crossbench peers on a 2-in, 1-out basis to increase the numbers?
We don't have any control over numbers. I mean, that was a Burns recommendation, which I personally support, but it's not within our power. We can't control who goes out and what the numbers are at all.
Okay, moving on. Ronnie Cowan, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just look at the numbers. It's very simple maths to say we've got 92 exempted hereditary peers and 26 Lord Spirituals. There's 118. Is that a good place to start? Or I think one by one, is there a place for hereditary peers right now in the House of Lords?
Well, that is left over from the Tony Blair reforms, is it not? And I'm sure that a government in the future will want to get rid of the hereditary peers. Having said that, some of them are absolutely outstanding and work very, very hard to merit their place. And that's
part of the problem, isn't it? That you've got an individual who may be very good at doing their job, so it gives them a carte blanche to say, well, hereditary peers have got a role to play here. That's not the point. The point is we've got 92 in rotation who are going to fill up positions.
Yes, yeah? I don't think anyone would complain if the hereditary peers were removed, though, as I've said, there is some respect and affection for them. I don't think anyone would complain. Speaking for myself, and this is very controversial, it may be that 26 bishops is a bit too much.
The one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that none of those people, those categories, and indeed some others, senior people no doubt, but have had any propriety check. And the one thing that I'm absolutely sure of, and I know that there some of the officials who work on that, the workload has risen dramatically because of the sort of political crises that I've been talking about, will groan when I say this. And also there are difficulties about the operation of having priority checks, and it's certainly another, you've just quite large numbers. But nonetheless, I am absolutely sure that there has to be a priority check. I, don't dissent in general from what it's now Baroness Deech's responsibility, what she said about it. But one thing is absolutely astounding, that we've left a loophole of that size in our Parliament, and that that should be corrected very quickly. And I say this, I've no longer got the responsibility or the hard work that will then follow from correcting it. So I'm going to be careful now and unsay what I just said.
There's two things there, Baroness. You said your future government would look at the issue of hereditary peers, but we've been saying this for a long time. I'm not aware of it being in anybody's manifesto for our forthcoming general election. So what faith have you got that they actually are going to do something about it?
Well, reform of the House of Lords was said to be a first-term issue if there were to be a Labour government, and then it seemed to recede into second term. But actually, I think the impetus will have to come from this committee and from the House of Commons to achieve reform. On the propriety issue, as Paul said, it's hard to imagine any bishop failing propriety.
Yes, of course.
On the other hand, then of course they wouldn't be afraid of facing up to it, would they? But certainly I think the hereditaries ought to be subject, while they're still here, to the same checks as other nominees.
Just do things that, if we're so sure that none of the bishops are going to fail the propriety test, and it's right and properly that they go through the propriety test. They would have nothing to fear. The groups such as the Humanists UK have proposed that faith leaders should be appointed on merit by HOLAC. Is that a role you would want to take on?
I haven't considered that. No, this is a huge issue, whether you should have faith leaders at all and bishops and so on. No, we haven't considered that. I don't have a formal view on that at all, no.
So given the makeup of society throughout the United Kingdom, do you think it's better there's just none there at all? Or should there be an attempt to try to cover all the different faith bases within the United Kingdom?
I think I would leave that to this committee and its report.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
We enjoy those kinds of responses from witnesses. Thank you very much. Enjoy. Last but no means least, Lloyd Russell-Moyle, please.
Thank you very much. Just on the faith, I represent one of the most irreligious constituencies in the country, and very proudly so. Over vast majority have no religious affiliations at all in my constituency. But do you look at religion for the HOLAC appointments in terms of diversity? Is that something you take into account?
Well, I've only been in post since November, but I don't think we ask questions on that, and I don't think we do. We're conscious
Seeing
of
that
the spread of
religion
religions.
and belief is a protected characteristic, is it something that should be taken into consideration, or is a blind kind of French secularist approach better?
Well, I think, again, I'd rather leave that to this committee, because the definitions of belief and what's a protected characteristic are very, very complex. And I wouldn't like to question a candidate on what their beliefs were and what category they fell in. So I think, again, I would leave that to you. I don't think I would want to go there right now.
That's perfectly fine. What level of attendance do you think is reasonable to expect for peers in the House?
Again, it's not something the Commission has considered. Speaking for myself, I think one would worry if somebody got down to, say, only 20% or less attendance. But that's just my own personal view.
There's a discussion about full-time and part-time peers. Should there be a distinction between what a full-time peer or a part-time peer would be expected to attend?
I think it all depends on the niche that they find themselves in once they are here. It could be that a political nominee doesn't devote themselves to any particular bill or interest, but is always here. And it could be, and this happens quite often with the crossbenchers, that they have another job, but there are certain issues they feel very strongly about. And once those issues come up, they're here all the time. And that seems to me perfectly acceptable, indeed a good thing, if their expertise is currently on the table. That's right. Baroness Kidron was a moving force in the online safety bill. Baroness Butler-Sloss was very much in the forefront over modern slavery and so on. And they're probably here the rest of the time too, but you see what I mean? If there's something that's really their issue, they do turn up, even if you might only call it part-time.
Some people, I don't want to get into specifics of individuals that have not been recommended by HOLAC, but some people have said, well, my applications haven't gone forward because I've indicated that I only want to work part-time or only want to work some specific times. As with always, these things are probably more complicated. But as a principle, having some members that are part-time and having some members that are full-time is a principle that you think works quite well at the moment?
Well, you need flexibility, I think. I mean, I'm just theorising. If somebody said that they could only turn up, on a Friday morning, that would be no good. Or if they had a very, very fixed timetable, I think you need flexibility. But if someone said no, only in months with an R in them or something, no, that wouldn't do. But, if someone has flexibility, they may be a busy person. We have, for example, clinicians amongst our number and lawyers, and they have busy jobs, but they are flexible, they're able to turn up when they're needed and when they want to. But if someone was absolutely rigid, then no, that would not be a good idea, no.
Yeah, that I do accept. Actually, even on HOLAC, there has been appointments of an issue about will you turn up, and I refer to the fact since 2007 at any rate, there's been a very explicit message from HOLAC and from the chair when someone is appointed long before my time, you will turn up, won't you? And I don't think it is unreasonable for us to be acting and looking at the people that we interview for crossbench peerages on the basis that they will be there, not necessarily every week. It was said to me at the first discussion, you will turn up, won't you? It's a job. I don't expect you to be in London every week, but most weeks. I think that was a common sense conversation that I had a point in 2007 myself, and I don't think that's. I think it's completely reasonable. There is a view that, which I understand, that if you're going for, and I'm not talking about appointments I no longer will have any say in, for crossbench peers, that one should just be concerned about a brilliant piece of expertise the House won't otherwise get. Now, I'm inclined to say, yes, entirely, we've got to be, we're the only people who are, but I think that the message should be the same as that has been for the last 16 years or so on. The message should be, this is a job, not an honour, and, we obviously expect if we, let's say, a great AI expert is appointed, that you turn up and do it, but we would like you to turn up to a reasonable degree. I do think that is reasonable.
I mean, willingness to attend could change from application to reality. So is HOLAC the best place body to address this, or are the mechanisms that are being developed now the better places to address some of these things?
I'm hoping that parties will develop or have developed mechanism to check up on people's attendance once they're here.
You said there was a mechanism now to eject people.
There is a
method,
yes,
at all.
For non-attendance for a whole year,
Yeah.
of course. The other issue is age. If you want someone here 4 days a week, most of the weeks of the year, they're going to either be retired or have a very flexible job, or possibly have a spouse who supports them. But if you want younger members who need to work to earn a living, it's quite difficult, actually, because there is no support here apart from expenses.
I mean, it's not unusual for other second chambers around the world to meet in much more condensed, short periods, and they set a timetable that works for people that have other jobs. But that would require a whole change of the way the House of Lords works. So, in terms of the kind of House of Lords Conduct Committee, which looks at the kind of non-attendance, if you've not attended for a whole period of time, and you mentioned there that the parties should play a role in terms of filtering some of that out. Is there not a danger that becomes partisan rather than factual? Kind of a change of leader of a party, they try and get rid of the people internally in their party they don't like, rather than getting rid of the people who aren't doing the work.
Well, I don't feel qualified to comment on that. That is, as you said, a political issue, not something that HOLAC can deal with. But just bearing in mind the numbers issue, one would hope that the parties would keep their members under check and make sure that they are turning up, or develop some method for encouraging them. But I can't go beyond that.
Can I just very briefly comment? It's a very insightful question you put, right? But actually, I'm just in my mind's eye thinking what's happened over the past years. When you get a change of leader in the party, it's not so much that there's discipline against certain people we don't want to turn up. Some people do say, I was completely with the previous leader who has now fallen, and I'm not going to be around so much. That is actually what what I notice over time, that people, that's what I notice happening, just as a matter of fact, in the House of Lords.
I mean, we did have a former Prime Minister kicked out a good number of people of his party from the Commons just before the last election, and there's a danger that then carries over into the Lords. If I may just ask one additional question. In some of the previous evidence that we had, there was put to us the idea that rather than party leaders directly appointing, they could give a list to HOLAC, and HOLAC could then choose from that list the diversity. Do you think that takes away too much of the power of the Prime Minister and the parties, or is that something that is worth exploring?
Again, I wonder whether a Prime Minister would ever agree to that. I mean, I think it's
might
rather...
agree to it to the opposition leaders, but not
them. Well, yeah. Opposition. I think it's a rather good idea, but I would welcome it. But I have a feeling that it would be too much relinquishment of power for a leader to contemplate. Though in an ideal world, that sounds like a rather good idea. I can't see it happening, though. I wish it would, but I don't think it will.
Perfect response.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think that concludes the questions from the committee. So, Baroness Deech, Lord Bew, thank you both very much indeed for sharing your experience and your ongoing experience with HOLAC this morning. We're all very grateful indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We welcome the opportunity and we look forward to your report.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Order.
you.
Order. Thank you all. Thank you.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has ended.